Hello and welcome to Chopper's Brexit podcast. As you can tell, I am not Christopher Hope. I am in fact Camilla Tominey, Associate Editor of the Telegraph. Chris is taking a well-earned break. Some in this building have questioned the timing of that. But of course, the podcast never sleeps. It never takes a holiday. And with this week of weeks upon us, Boris Johnson, star Daily Telegraph columnist, now Prime Minister, behind the black door of number 10, this is the week to discuss how he might save Brexit and run Britain. And I have with me two experts in their field, Phil Johnston, who is the chief leader writer of The Telegraph and also a columnist, and Gordon Rayner, the Telegraph's political editor, who used to be the chief reporter and indeed used to work with me on the Royal Beat. But now we're into the lobby, into politics and into discussing whether Boris can save the day. Phil, the weight of expectation on this man is huge. What's your opinion? Can Boris do it? Can he pull Brexit off by October the 31st?
I think he can. It'll be extremely difficult. One of the things you can say about Boris is that life is always much more interesting when he's around, and certainly he proved that with the first appointments that he made yesterday in the cabinet, and the fact that he's just hit the ground running and is determined, as he said himself during the election campaign for the leadership, do or die. He's going to try to get the country out of the EU by October the 31st. Now, I think he can do it, but equally he could die by it. It's a hugely high-risk strategy, but I think what he's done here is to say, I'm serious. This is a team that will show that I'm serious, and most important of all, of course, it will show the European Union side that he's serious, because up to now I don't think they believe that he is.
Gordon, what did you make of his speech on Downing Street steps yesterday? He seemed to be in serious mode, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, we had the day before when he was appointed Tory leader, we had the sort of rather bombastic Boris talking about dude, pointing his finger at the Tory MPs. On the steps of Downing Street, we saw Boris in a much more statesman-like mode, but at the same time, he was still very much sticking to his method of getting his message across to the people by talking about the doom mongers, the naysayers, the gloomsters, words that you would never hear coming out of Theresa May's mouth. So it was more serious, but still very Boris, very, very committed. He hasn't really left himself any wriggle room at all now. He stood there as Prime Minister and said, we'll be leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs, no buts. He said that people who bet against Britain will lose their shirt. So it's a high stakes game now, and somebody's going to lose their shirt.
Phil, you seem to like this speech because the leader this morning was talking about its welcome optimism. He's trying to present himself as the Tigger to Theresa May's Eeyore, isn't he? This sense of purpose, to end pessimism and have a positive vision of Britain, almost trying to channel his inner Churchill there. We know that that's one of his political heroes. Were you surprised by the fact that that speech actually included some policy announcements?
I was a bit, actually. I think it was a bit too detailed on domestic policy, insofar as you're not going to have any domestic policy unless you deliver Brexit. There's no majority in the House of Commons for the government anyway. There's a working majority of 3 with the DUP, which goes down to 1 if they lose in Brecon and Radnor. People keep saying it goes down to 2, but it actually goes down to 1, of course, because you add the seat to the opposition. So he's in no position to produce a Queen's speech or a budget. They'll just be voted down in Parliament. I mean, a budget, less so, but you don't need a budget until November. So, yeah, I was a bit surprised at that because it's really roll your sleeves up and get the 31st of October deadline fixed in your head and move everything towards it. And I think that's what they're going to do. I mean, you said in your introduction, I think you're absolutely right, that what's interesting about this team, particularly the backroom team, but equally some of the frontroom people, is that it looks more like a campaign organisation than a government. I mean, there's clearly post-Brexit, there may be scope for changing heads again, but this is to get Brexit done, and if not, to fight a general election. People like Dominic Cummings, who we may come on to later, who's been brought into the campaign team, Priti Patel at the Home Office. Dom Raab and all the others. I mean, they're people who you can well see in the event of a general election having to happen, which I think it will. And as I wrote in my column this week, I think it should, if Boris really wants to strike while the iron's hot. They look to me like a campaign unit, and they can seamlessly, if it doesn't go right, move into that.
Gordon, do you agree with that? I mean, we'll get on to the appointment of Dominic Cummings and indeed some of the top cabinet posts. But there was this sense in Downing Street yesterday that Boris was coming out with very, very consumerish policies in a bid to tee himself up for electoral success. But of course, he's got this dilemma. If he calls a general election before Brexit is delivered, we could have another hung parliament. So the only option really is to try and shore up the majority if he managed to be successful on Halloween. Yeah,
I think what's been really quite striking, talking to Tory MPs and people close to Boris Johnson, has been their inability to say anything convincing that would lead you to think there's not going to be an election. The line from Boris in the last few days has been all about that it's not a priority. Well, of course it's not a priority, but that's very different from saying there's no way that it's going to happen. Matt Hancock was sent out onto the airwaves and he said it was not a priority. He also said he hoped that it wouldn't be for quite a long time. Then we had Jacob Rees-Mogg saying it's by no means impossible. This is not the language of an organisation that is expecting an election to happen in 2022. And certainly I think the people on Boris's team that we've spoken to, I think the feeling among them is that if we get to a point where Parliament passes a law which prevents no deal, which is what they would have to do to prevent no deal, then an election would basically have to happen. And certainly there have been more people in the last few days who have been willing to discuss the idea of Parliament possibly passing a law to do that than perhaps there were 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Phil, you've got a huge amount of experience with political thinking. Do you think Boris Johnson can win an election? I mean, I appreciate it's about the timing, but there's this sense that he is the only Tory capable of putting Nigel Farage back in his box.
Well, indeed. And I think what you'll see in the next few days is the polls moving quite markedly towards the Conservatives, because I think that Brexit party vote, which has gone to Farage because they feel that the mainstream politicians aren't actually going to take us out of the EU, they'll think Boris is. So, I mean, the obvious way, there is probably an electoral winning pact between the Conservatives and the Brexit party. Nigel Farage is obviously very toxic to Conservatives, but the Brexit party is quite a different animal from UKIP. Most of its members and most of its MEPs, for instance, are Conservatives. I mean, we're going to say we've got people who were in the Conservative government, like Anne Widdecombe. Most of the people who stood in the European elections were for either Conservative councillors, some were from different bits of the political spectrum. But yes, he can win an election and he could do it that way. He won in London, a city that is traditionally seen as a Labour city, twice against a charismatic left-wing leader, far more charismatic indeed than Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn has got, Labour Party has got 18% in the polls. That's why I argued this week, and oddly enough, I noticed that Danny Finkelstein in the Times wrote exactly the same piece. It'd be better to hold a snap election on your own terms than to be forced into one. And I think, Gordon is right that if the Parliament passes legislation, which I think they will, this is exactly how it will be done, Bercow, the Speaker, will give time for a small, short bill to rush through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And that will be a defeat for Boris, and then he will have to go to the country. Now, he may then be able to get a narrative going, look, they've done this to us, but it'll be partly his own party that have done it to him, which is going to make it then more difficult in an election against the Brexit party. So why not go early?
Gordon, there are two main reasons seemingly now why Labour voters are disenfranchised. They don't like Corbyn and indeed some of the very hard left policies that Corbyn stands behind, and indeed the anti-Semitism row continues to engulf Labour. There are also Labour leavers who do not feel represented by the party's constructive ambiguity over whether they back Remain or not. Do you think Johnson can win these people over?
Well, I think he can win some of them over Camilla. He undoubtedly, there are Labour leavers who are becoming incredibly frustrated with what's going on. They're becoming incredibly frustrated with the antics of the Labour Party and the leadership in particular. And we only on Wednesday, after Prime Minister's questions, Jeremy Corbyn's Director of Strategy, Seamus Milne, was asked whether Labour was now a party of Remain, and he still couldn't say, even though an awful lot of his MPs are saying that Labour is now the party of Remain. They can't make their minds up. They're just as divided as the Tories, if not more so, over Europe and over what to do next. So yeah, I think there are Labour voters to be won over by Boris Johnson, but the problem is, if he were to call an election, those same people could just as easily be won over by the Brexit Party, perhaps even more so.
What's interesting as well with the protests that we saw in the streets, we got back late home yesterday for obvious reasons, and I passed people still carrying placards likening Boris to Trump, calling him a racist right-winger. He's not really a right-winger, is he, Phil?
Not at all. I mean, and neither is he a racist, and quite frankly, I think it's pretty shabby for... I listened to the BBC interviews. People were saying this without being challenged at all. I mean, without being too personal about it, but Boris was married to a half-Indian woman. He's a social liberal. I mean, he's quite different from a lot of social conservatives, some of whom are now in the cabinet, of course, like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Priti Patel. But in his outlook, he's very liberal and progressive, Tory, I suppose you would call them. He showed that in London. He showed that on issues like immigration. He's brought people together not because they are sort of Ayn Rand Thatcherites or because they're, proto-fascists. He's brought them together to do something which the country actually voted to happen. And Parliament hasn't let it happen. And that's why I always come back to the point that until you have a Parliament that is prepared to pass the referendum decision, you are not going to proceed. You're not going to get anywhere, which is, I sound like a stuck record. That's why an election in the end is going to be inevitable. I mean, the alternative is that they may get something through. The Europeans may say, OK, we'll give you something on the backstop. Boris manages to persuade the ERG to accept or swallow it, maybe a 7-year transition or whatever. And then they squeak home. And after that, then the opportunities for the Conservatives are very good. But until then, it's touch and go, really.
Gordon, do you see some of these cabinet appointees, the likes of Dominic Raab, Priti Patel, Sajid Javid, Rees-Mogg, they are Thatcherite Conservatives. Are they the ones who are going to do some of Boris Johnson's right-wing dirty work, if we can put it like that? And how are they going to get on with the likes of more moderate cabinet ministers like Amber Rudd, who's been retained along with Matt Hancock?
Yeah, well, Amber Rudd is an interesting one, isn't she? Because remember Bamba, only not that long ago, a few weeks ago, people were all talking about Boris Johnson and Amber Rudd forming a joint leadership ticket because, as Phil quite rightly said, they are incredibly close in terms of their One Nation Tory ideology. The only thing they really disagree on is Brexit. But he's kept her in the cabinet. He realises that she's a talent. He's very good friends with her. Clearly, one of the hardest jobs he's going to have over the next few months is trying to unite the Tory party, never mind uniting the country. And that's very difficult to see how he does that. He's sacked an awful lot of people who were Remain voters, some of whom weren't Remain voters, but who made the mistake of supporting Jeremy Hunt, like Liam Fox. And that's very divisive. So he's now going to have a lot of enemies on the backbenches, more than he had even before he did the reshuffle. So he needs people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Priti Patel to appeal to the far right of the party, the very hardline members of the European Research Group, which Jacob Rees-Mogg chairs. And he needs people like Amber Rudd to appeal to the far left of the party, if you like, as well. But quite whether you can pull off that trick is another thing, because ultimately you have to make decisions, and it doesn't matter how much you schmooze people; they may well not like the decisions that you take.
I mean, I just want to say there are one or two interestingly Trump-esque things that have happened. one of which, of course, is the appointment of Joe Johnston to the government. Can't recall...
Very late last night as well, wasn't it?
For a long time, a Prime Minister appointing a member of his own family. The last one to do it, I think, was James Callaghan, who appointed Peter Jay to be ambassador to Washington.
Yes.
Peter Jay was married to Jim Callaghan's daughter.
That's right.
And the word nepotism suddenly entered the political lexicon and had to be explained to everybody, caused a huge row. Now, obviously, Joe Johnston's not in such a prominent position. Maybe Stanley Johnson will be the next ambassador to Washington.
Well, what's interesting as well is Joe Johnston, of course, fell on his sword as universities minister over the notion of not being able to support no deal. Does his promotion to energy minister mean he now is in line with his brother's thinking on Brexit do or die and has had a Damascene conversion of the likes of Amber Rudd's?
As far as I know, Camilla, that is the requirement of office.
Yeah.
You know, they've been told that you sign the pledge.
What was fascinating was on the day that Boris launched his leadership campaign with lots of converts to the Boris cause, like James Brokenshire in the front row, who sadly that didn't work for him. He's been sacked. Joe Johnston went to his brother's launch event, and he looked like a man who was on his way to the gallows. He looked quite ashen-faced, and we had a bit of a joke with him about it on the way there. But it is bizarre, frankly, that someone who is so staunchly opposed to a no-deal Brexit can be brought into the cabinet. And as I said there, it was one that was sneaked out very late at night.
Yes.
Too late, really, for many of the newspapers to make a big deal of it. Not sure that was a coincidence.
Oh, right. So there's some suspicious timing. Although I suppose if he's had the family three-line whip that he needs to support, it was for Joe Johnston to turn around and say, sorry, bruv, I can't quite manage this. I mean, I suppose all politicians weigh up family loyalty and personal ambition and make decisions from then onwards. Yeah,
well, blood is thicker, isn't it? And I think, in the Johnston family as much as in any.
We should also remember, of course, that it isn't actually Boris's policy to leave without a deal. As he once said...
It's 1,000,000 to 1.
1,000,000 to 1, as he once said. As he said about 3 weeks ago, but it seems like about 8 years ago. It's 1,000,000 to 1 chance, and that's what they intend it to be. So we're in the game of a sort of gigantic, bluff, basically. He's put together a team which in Europe will send alarm bells ringing, who they will say, my goodness me, they are serious. Are they serious? With May and when she was Prime Minister, it was quite clear she wasn't serious.
Yes.
It's probably pretty clear that Boris isn't either. He doesn't want no deal. Most of them don't want no deal, but they can't risk that bluff. I mean, it is like this sort of nuclear deterrent, really. Well, let's talk about the person who's got the codes to the nuclear deterrent, Michael Gove. Did his appointment as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster surprise you, Phil? I've lost the capacity to be surprised over the last 3 years. The Brexit psychodrama continues then. Absolutely, yeah. Do you think it was a case of him wanting to keep his friends close and his enemies closer, or do you think they've buried the hatchet now? I don't think they'll be wary of one another. Boris more so of Michael. And look, what he's done here is pull together the same team that ran the referendum. And Boris, you have to remember about Boris, he's not a details man. He's a great person for delegation. He's done it in every walk of life that he's been involved in, from editing The Spectator to running London. He's not afraid, because he's a very bright man himself, to have around him very bright people. He doesn't feel like May did or Gordon Brown, threatened by good people, so let's have lots of duds. He knows that Michael, they used to say Michael was the brains and Boris is the heart, and essentially Michael's job is a backroom job now, is to get things prepared, get things ready. He's got a team like that. Boris's job is the front man. Yes. Always has been. He's not a great man for detail, so he's a good man at appointing people who are. Now, it doesn't mean to say that they're bosom buddies, but Boris is actually quite good at forgiving people, and he quite often doesn't really understand why people don't like him. Yes. He's a bit like Trump in that too. Given that Boris once called Trump a moron, I think, when he was mayor of London. Yes. now that he's a great friend of Trump, Trump has forgiven him.
He accused him of stupefying ignorance, didn't he, when Trump
indeed.
had suggested that there were some no-go areas in London because of knife crime. Gordon, what do you make, though, and I think we can all watch with interest as the Johnson-Gove psychodrama continues to play out. But what do you make of Dominic Cummings' appointment? Because obviously he is a Gove acolyte. He's extremely close to Michael, and he is got mixed reviews, to be honest, from the Vote Leave days. We know the Benedict Cumberbatch film depicted him as a hero and a genius, but some describe him as a destructive madman. What's your view?
Well, I mean, that was possibly the most fascinating and shocking of all the appointments that Boris made yesterday. I don't think anybody had particularly seen it coming. I don't remember reading anywhere that he was going to be brought in. And he is he's a man, rather like Michael Gove, he's a man who gets things done. The fascinating thing is going to be watching just how he manages to interact with the civil service, because he will have very clear and probably rather radical ideas of what should happen. The civil service, rather less so. Can he overcome the problem of getting the civil service on board, or will it just lead to an absolutely almighty bust-up?
Well, this was the interesting thing. We saw the cabinet meeting for the first time this morning. Mark Sedwill is there sitting next to him, and then further down the table is Gavin Williamson, who has been appointed Education Secretary, having had a major bust-up with the Cabinet Secretary over the Huawei leak.
Yeah.
So is Boris trying to send a message there to the civil service, Phil?
Well, that was the last government. We're in a new government now. We're in a new era. Yes, of course, he sent a civil message. I mean, I don't think Mark Sedwill will be there that much longer.
Really?
I mean, he's there for the transition, of course. I mean, don't forget, Mark is actually really a diplomat, and he came from the Foreign Office, and I suspect that's what he would like to go back to doing. There is a way, of course, of giving Cummings the whip hand over the civil service. They don't like it, of course, but this was done by Tony Blair, who gave Alastair Campbell and Jonathan Powell special powers, or through an order in council, whereby they actually could order civil servants around. They could give that to Dominic Cummings. It would probably cause something of a row in Whitehall, but there's going to be one anyway, because he's not somebody who he could walk into a room on his own and pick a fight, let's face it.
Well, how do you see Boris's premiership unfolding, Gordon? Is this going to be sofa government? Is this going to be presidential? A first among equals approach? How do you view Boris currently? Because he has changed somewhat since his days covering Brussels for this newspaper. He's
when I was political correspondent.
Well, but in fact, while we're on that subject, Phil, just tell us a bit about how he was back in the day and when he worked here as a cub reporter.
Yes, well, I knew him. He was the European correspondent when I was the political correspondent, and so we covered a lot of summits together. And he was a journalist. I mean, he was looking for a story like we all were, and he covered them with great aplomb and terrific attitude. He and I covered the Rome summit that where they ambushed Thatcher over the European single currency, and that changed. It changed my view of Europe. Not that matters, because I'm not a politician, but it also changed Boris's. This sort of fatuous OE talked about bent cucumbers and straight bananas and all the rest of it. Maybe one or two stories that he was on the lookout. But the big story, which he covered, and I remember a conversation at the time, and we splashed the paper on it, was the fact that Britain could not stop this move towards single currency and eventually the Maastricht Treaty. Thatcher tried to apply the veto, which we all thought we had, and within a month of that meeting, she was out of office. And I think that actually had an impact on his view, a lot of people's views of Europe, actually. I mean, the Maastricht Treaty was the moment in which a lot of people who previously had been pro-Europe, including Margaret Thatcher, of course, took the view that we'd probably be better off out of this. It's taken an awful long time. But in those days, he was a journalist, and he still maintains a lot of journalistic instincts. Because let's face it, he's been in and out of government or political office for the last 20 years, always going back to his first home, which is writing. Yeah.
Gordon, the US president has described him as Britain's Trump. Is he?
Or Britain Trump.
Yes.
As the president said. I'm not, I can't...
Brackets sick.
Yeah, I don't know whether he meant the British Trump or Britain's Trump. It was a very odd phrase, and he said it twice, which confused everybody and made it very hard to write stories about it because it didn't really make sense. Is he the British Trump? I don't think so. I think he is much more tolerant than Donald Trump is. I think he's probably much more politically astute than Donald Trump is. I think what he shares with him is that he has a tremendous ability to connect with people. He has a tremendous ability to communicate his ideas and get people to understand what it is that he's trying to achieve. He also has blonde hair, of course, although whether either man's blonde hair is natural or not, we don't know. Boris denied.
That is a subject for another podcast.
Dyeing it. So no, I think that's wrong, and I don't think that Boris or anybody in his team particularly welcomed the analogy.
Okay, to sum up then, chaps, one word if you can. How do you see a Boris Johnson Brexit going, Phil?
Rollercoaster ride. It's probably 2 words.
Gordon?
Yeah, I suppose knife edge is probably the word I would use.
Oh, it's going to be dramatic. Thank you very, very much to Phil Johnston for being with us and Gordon Rayner for joining in today's Chopper's Brexit podcast without Chopper, but he will be back next week. I'd also like to thank the podcast producers Elliot Lampert and Theo Leludis. And if you're all caught up on Chopper's Brexit podcast, don't forget that you can get 30 days access to the Telegraph online completely free at telegraph.co.uk/Chopper. I can personally recommend a number of pieces, including, of course, Phil Johnston's excellent columns. We've had Alison Pearson writing on Boris today. We've had John Curtis, the professor who is renowned as the country's best pollster, talking about Boris Johnson's chances. They're all online. And if you want to get in touch, you can find me on Twitter at Camilla Tominey, or you can email us at choppersbrexitpodcast, all one word, at telegraph.co.uk. As Chopper would say, until next time, cheerio.
Hello, Chopper listeners. I'm Peter Foster, the Telegraph's Europe editor, and I wanted to let you know about another way you can stay up to date with Brexit on those long, lonely days when you're all caught up on Chopper's Brexit podcast. It's my Brexit Bulletin newsletter. Every weekday, I compile the best news and analysis from the Telegraph's Brexit team, including my esteemed colleagues Asa Bennett in London and James Crisp in Brussels. I can't predict how this unstable period will end, but I can arm you with the facts in your inbox at 5 p.m. sharp, Monday to Friday. Just search Telegraph Brexit Bulletin or click on the link in the podcast show notes.